Proposals to legalise assisted suicide in Britain were defeated by huge majorities in Westminster and Holyrood back in 2015. The activists, eager to end the legal protections for some of the most vulnerable people in society, switched their attention to the courts. But now they're back for another attempt at changing the law. Baroness Meacher's assisted suicide bill is scheduled to be debated in the House of Lords later this month. It would allow patients thought to have less than 6 months to live to obtain drugs to commit suicide. In Scotland, the public consultation on a similar proposal is already underway. The term assisted suicide isn't used, of course. They believe rebranding it to assisted dying will make it more palatable to the uninformed. Skating over the lack of safeguards for the elderly, infirm and disabled, the campaigners argue that they want to offer a peaceful end, dignity in dying. In fact, the Voluntary Euthanasia Society changed its name to just that. It's an appealing idea. Who would want an undignified death? But finally, this narrative of taking drugs in order to have a peaceful end is under scrutiny. Dr. Joel Zivot is an Associate Professor of Anaesthesiology and Surgery at the Emory School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. He wrote a piece for The Spectator, arguing that assisted suicide is neither painless nor dignified. In fact, quite the reverse. Dr. Zivot joins me now from Atlanta. Dr. Zivot, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to me.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Well, let's start with your expertise in this area. Can you just sort of spell out why you're qualified to speak on the issue of the use of drugs and what those drugs do in the area of assisted suicide?
So by training and practice, I am an anesthesiologist, and I've been practicing for about 26 years in the operating room in intensive care. Here in the United States, we have something that is no longer present in Britain, and that is that people who are convicted of certain crimes, that the punishment for them may be execution. Now, execution in the United States has taken on many forms, and how exactly it's carried out. In the current and latest version, execution is performed by something that has been called lethal injection. And what lethal injection involves is it involves the placing of an intravenous in the arm of the condemned, and then medicine, now repurposed as poison, is injected into the individual, and as a consequence, they die. Now, lethal injection, to my mind, has a distressing similarity to a medical act. And let's be clear that here in America, that the professional medical societies do not consider execution to be a medical act in any way, but it does impersonate one. As an anesthesiologist, I was called on to render an opinion about the technique of execution and specifically exactly how death may occur. There is a rule in the United States that a person, when they are punished, that the form of that punishment cannot be cruel. And so I was asked a question as to whether I thought that execution in the form of lethal injection would be cruel. The cruelty is a complicated question. Our sense of what is cruel, of course, may change commensurate with the maturation and evolution of civil society. Certain forms of execution have come and gone, but lethal injection hangs on. Now, initially, when I got involved in execution, I was very distressed to find that these chemicals were being used in this way, and that it struck me by design that there were opportunities that when an inmate died, that death might be painful. But it was hard to know. And when I had an occasion where I was working on behalf of an inmate who invited me to watch his execution with the idea that as a physician, that perhaps my medical eye could detect something in execution that would be beneficial to others. I went as invited for this reason and watched the execution. And what struck me was how I saw actually very little. There was not much to see at all. There was some movement that I did detect, that I could see, but it was very much hard to make note of what I had actually observed. And it it concerned me. Now, as it turned out, that several years later, I was handed a pile of autopsies, a stack of autopsies of individuals who were executed by lethal injection. And I was asked a question about the level of certain kinds of chemicals in the blood and whether these things could correspond, rather could be the reason that a person might die. But the autopsies were not only recording the levels of medication or chemicals in the blood, it was also a full autopsy that examined all the solid organs of the body after death. This is a standard procedure in an autopsy. And when I looked through the entirety of the autopsy, I was struck by something that had never occurred to me before and had never been described. And that was that very commonly, more than 80% of the time, the autopsy showed that when individuals died from lethal injection, they died with congestion in their lungs filled with fluid at the time of death. And this has a special name. It's called pulmonary edema. And it's basically akin to taking a big glass of water and pouring it down into your windpipe and filling your lungs with water from the inside. It's exceedingly uncomfortable. I'm sure that people have had the experience of when they drink water or have a drink of something or even swallow something and by mistake, it may touch the vocal cords or even go into the windpipe. This is exceedingly uncomfortable and distressing and terrifying. And so what I realized I was looking at was that death here was not at all as it was branded, which was that a person would simply fall asleep and then die. In fact, what was happening was that it was death by drowning. A very uncomfortable death, but because of the combination of chemicals used, that even to the trained medical eye, myself, I could not detect this. But the point of execution here is that it's not the experience for the witness that matters. It's only the experience of the person that dies. And that is the point where the law is drawn. And that is a bright line. Now, what struck me here about this, and I've now written about this and commented on this as in The Spectator, is that it occurred to me that the kind of chemical, the class of chemicals that are used specifically for execution are the same class of chemicals used for assisted death, assisted dying. And that was very troubling to me because assisted dying, of course, is marketed, if you will, in a very similar fashion to execution. That is to say that this is a peaceful death and that the death that is occurring outwardly will be peaceful.
So you would say then, would you, that it is a valid comparison to say, well, the drugs that are being used in the cases of executions in the US is a valid comparison with forms of assisted suicide? Because I suspect that there would be plenty of people who would say you're just not drawing a fair comparison. These are two entirely different things. You would say no.
I would push back on that because here's where the similarities lie. In both situations, the desire is to cause the death of an individual. And in both situations, the drugs that are used to cause that death are identical, the same class of drugs.
Right.
Now, in one case, the drugs are delivered as pills. In the other case, the drugs are delivered as an injection. But these differences are, I think, will be shown ultimately not to be material. And the point of all of this is that the claim is made without a shred of evidence that the kind of death that occurs here is peaceful in both cases. And there has been no evidence to support this claim.
Okay, you're in America, so you have a handle on sort of the US experience. There's about 10 states where assisted suicide is legal in some form or another. In terms of the legislation that's passing here, Oregon is probably the best comparison. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of some of the changes that you are aware of how the law has been has perhaps morphed over time, and the impact it's had on people from the introduction of assisted suicide in Oregon, and how that's changed over time.
I think that I have to start by saying that in the medical tradition, that killing, the act of killing, has not ever been considered to be a treatment. Now, if killing was a treatment, it would be used in many more situations than it might even currently be used now. And I know the public might find this to be hard to accept, but from a practical perspective, once killing is a treatment, it can be used. And what has happened is two things. There has been this progressive desire to try to write rules to include more and more and more people who desire it. So in fact, the pattern here has been a widening of access to individuals, not a narrowing. And the escalation of the use of this has also occurred with respect to techniques and with respect to how it might be delivered. So as another example, I might point to Canada, which began with something akin to what is now being debated in the UK. But let's be clear that if it begins with pills, that individuals who might be ill and who may be seeking this may not be able to swallow. There's a whole problem of the technical aspects of swallowing. And so once you allow this to take place, it's only logical that the next thing that will take place is that the drugs will have to be given by injection because once a right of dying is claimed, then of course there is a corollary duty that is introduced. And now it falls upon medicine to create a method of dying that the legislation demands. And this is not, it's not that this experiment has to be pondered. It has already occurred. So Britain only has to look to other jurisdictions to see how the story of assisted dying evolves.
And unfortunately, people are looking abroad and saying that this is what we want to follow, because, I mean, interestingly, it's not just the States and Canada, in the Netherlands and Belgium as well. You see this constant progression where, as you say, the door gets wider and wider rather than narrower and narrower, and it goes to more people and younger people, and the protections or the safeguards, so-called, that get talked about initially get removed and expanded and so on over time. Well,
yes. Can I just make another point here?
Sure.
If I may. So I think we need to just mention a couple of things. We need to mention that this concept of dignity is not owned by the proponents of this. That dignity is something that can take on many things. And there is something about the dignity of being present when someone is dying. And I have been present many, many times. As an ICU physician, I have been there many times. And it is possible and conceivable to provide comfort without killing people. That I believe is very dignified. It's also wrong to suggest that if you are someone who is against this legislation or this form of managing this problem, that therefore you are a person that is uncaring or inconsiderate or advocates somehow that death should be painful. This is absolutely the opposite of what is true. That and further, and perhaps finally, that assisted dying occurred without a shred of evidence, without a shred of investigation, that it actually was delivering what it said it was. It was only outwardly appearing to be so. And there are many cases of examples where assisted dying has gone off the rails, and it's been quite a terrible kind of death. And when I have now, in my work here and in my writing, I've been accused of creating something or making a claim without evidence. I think that I have strong evidence here, and I would push back on those who say that there's no evidence. I would challenge them to say, you produce your evidence that what you're advocating here is safe, causes a kind of death that is as you claim, and that will not put at risk vulnerable populations, I would push back and say, you show me your evidence.
So, and what would you, as a final question, what would you say to the politicians in Britain who have bought this line that it is a humanitarian act to be behind assisted suicide and are giving it their support?
I must tell you, I'm stunned by this. To suggest somehow that medicine has nothing to offer here, except the only way to manage these terrible kinds of painful states is through killing people, and to say that this is somehow humanitarian and somehow is the most favorable state in managing this is shocking to me. I would say that there is a perfectly good alternative here, which is to promote palliative care, which I believe in Britain, the proponents of palliative care feel very strongly that they are being unreasonably sidelined. They should be supported. I'm very much in favor of providing comfort for people as they die. But to suggest that the only dignified and humanitarian way to manage this is to kill them, this is just nonsense.
Dr. Joel Zivot in Atlanta, thank you very much for making that so clear to us and speaking so powerfully. Very much appreciate it. Thank you.